Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Yvonne Thomas and I am the Education Specialist at the Island Institute. I will be co-presenting today with my friend Mandy Metrano, who is the teacher at the school on Monhegan. So next slide. Great. So it is often said that schools are the heart of isolated rural communities, and this is absolutely true of the 1- and 2-room schools that you'll be hearing about today. Although these schools often conjure up nostalgic images of how education was 100 years ago, in reality, they are technology-driven leaders that exemplify many of the most innovative ideas in education today. Looking at these tiny schools through the lens of the COVID-19 crisis provides a real-life example of how schools across the country might better meet the needs of their students through technology, now, during this incredibly disruptive time, and in the future. So before we get started, I've got a few housekeeping details about the webinar to go through. First, in full disclosure, this is our first time using the Zoom webinar platform, so we apologize for any glitches or issues. The next thing is the internet. So Mandy is on Monhegan, I am on Vinalhaven. Island Institute staff are working behind the scenes, zooming in from their homes, as are all of you. And so depending on conditions and location, there could be interruptions in our internet connection. We've got a plan B and a plan C lined up, so bear with us if there is a brief pause or interruption while we work things out. And just a note about this problem more broadly. Access to reliable, affordable, high-speed internet is an issue that rural families across the country have been facing and struggling with for years, and especially now. So broadband for all is a high priority issue for the Island Institute and one that we are working actively on. So this webinar is going to run about an hour, and during that time we will be answering your questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And then if time permits, we'll answer a few of them out loud at the end of the presentation. After the event, we will share additional information and resources. And Mandy will be mentioning a number of specific tools that she uses, and we'll include links to all of those as well. We're also going to record this webinar, and we will make a link available to the recording, and you're welcome to share that. So we're going to be using polls a couple of times in this webinar. And the poll feature really helps us learn a little bit about each other. And it reminds us that although we're scattered across cyberspace, we are all also together right now, connected by this shared interest in learning from Maine's smallest island schools. So let's go ahead and put up our first poll to find out a little bit about who we are and where we are. So if you could just take a second and answer those two questions quickly, and then we'll see what we get. Polls are moving. All right, looks like everybody's just about answered. So can you see the poll? Are we good? Yes, okay. So we've got a lot of educators, we've got some parents, we've got some parent educators, and then some general folks. And it looks like we've got a lot of people from Maine, as well as the islands and New England, other parts of the country, and even one person from another country. So that's great to just get a little bit of a sense of who we are out there. Thanks. All right. Next slide, great. So the coronavirus pandemic is wreaking havoc across the globe, from the actual physical illness and the loss of life to the emotional and financial pain that families are facing, to the economic devastation that the stay-at-home order is having on our communities. Everyone is feeling it. For schools, this crisis has meant sudden and lengthy closures and lots of uncertainty. The scramble to implement emergency remote learning has been both heroic and really hard. There is a huge range in how emergency remote learning is being implemented, from pencil and paper packets only to fully developed digital classrooms, with most schools using a bit of both. I cannot overstate the incredible effort and dedication that I've seen on the part of all involved, teachers, parents, and students. But in many ways, it is simply not possible to do this kind of teaching and learning really well for months on end with so little time to prepare. As a result, kids are struggling, and so are their teachers and parents. On an almost daily basis, I have conversations in which I remind them that as long as their child's or student's most basic needs, including the need to stay connected to a supportive adult, are being met, then that's good enough. In fact, that's great. So let's go to the next slide. Great. So the notion of using technology to sustain vibrant connection during ongoing and extreme isolation is a core element of the Outer Islands Teaching and Learning Collaborative, or the TLC, which is a 10-year-old collaboration between the 1 and 2 room schools of Maine's 1 and 2 room Maine Island schools. The same urgent need to connect and collaborate through technology that led to this TLC's founding is now being felt by educators, students, and parents everywhere. The TLC has already been doing high-quality remote learning for a long time. And while the school closures were by no means easy for the TLC, both the students and the teachers were much more prepared to make this transition than most. If you look at the current slide, you'll see a Zoom meeting with TLC students and teachers. And I'm just wondering how many of you have been in virtual meetings like that look like this. And that will bring us to our second poll. So let's go ahead and put that poll up and find out about your experience with Zoom or similar platforms. So go ahead and answer the 2 questions about your use of Zoom now and your use of Zoom before the COVID crisis. Lots of answering happening right now. Okay, looks like just about everybody's in. So we'll post those results. So as you can see, there's a range, and in a very short period of time, this way of connecting and learning has become much more commonplace because the need for it now is urgent for almost all of us, just as it was for the founding TLC teachers 10 years ago. And urgency is a very powerful motivator. So let's go to the next slide. Great. All right, oops. Okay. So just a month ago, the idea of massive numbers of students and teachers meeting virtually on a daily basis seemed pretty far-fetched. For both before and now during the COVID crisis, the TLC has been using Zoom with students for academics such as book groups and story hour. We have morning exercises as part of our PE. We have weekly student council meetings, and we have celebrations, parties, and fun. So for example, this week is Spirit Week for the TLC. So here we are yesterday, it was Animal Day, and in the corner on the bottom left, that is Mandy. So in addition to these daily gatherings with students, we also use Zoom for teachers for weekly planning meetings and for other professional development, such as in-depth discussions on relevant topics. So let's go to slide 8. So while we are focused today on the 1 and 2 room island schools of the TLC, there are a total of 13 unbridged island schools in Maine clustered along 3 parts of the coast: Casco Bay, the Mid-Coast, and the MDI and Down East area. The combined total enrollment for all the island schools is just under 500 students, and the smallest school has 3 kids, and the largest has about 180. The TLC schools, which I've put little arrows next to, are Cliff down in Casco Bay, and then working our way up the coast, we have Monhegan, Matinicus, Idaho, Frenchboro, and the Cranberries up by Mount Desert Island. We also have Cuttyhunk, which you'll see the arrow pointing down at the bottom of the screen. And Cuttyhunk is the only 1-room island school in Massachusetts, and they are also part of the TLC this year. The total enrollment for the TLC schools is about 30, And the smallest TLC schools have from 0 to 3 kids, and the largest has 10. The grade range for these schools goes from pre-K to 8th grade. So we have 4-year-olds all the way up to 14-year-olds. So going to the next slide. So now let's shift our attention to the Monhegan Island School and their teacher, Mandy Metrano. Mandy is an exceptional island educator. And in fact, she's one of the strongest teachers I've worked with in my 25-year career in education. She's flexible and unflappable, 2 qualities that serve her very well as an outer island teacher, and she's also an excellent collaborator. Mandy often takes a leadership role in her community and within the TLC. And a big part of her effectiveness is her relentless dedication to meeting the ever-changing needs of her students. And that's true now more than ever. We were a little hesitant about asking Mandy to be part of this webinar because all teachers right now are being taxed in unprecedented ways, and I didn't want to add one more thing to her plate. But as so often happens with Mandy, she was willing to step up and share the powerful and timely lessons of her experience with the TLC. So thank you, Mandy, and now I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Yvonne. I want to thank Yvonne and the Island Institute for supporting the TLC. Yvonne has been present for so much transition in the TLC, including a couple of years ago when the last of the founding TLC teachers left. At that point, Yvonne shifted from a supporting role in the TLC to a leadership one. She's always been a staunch advocate for all island students and teachers, and she's been both a cheerleader and a bulldog, particularly for those of us in the TLC, which is why it's not surprising that she and the rest of the education team went into immediate action when the disruption of in-person schooling was announced. On Sunday night, March 15th, Governor Mills issued a civil state of emergency and recommended that Maine schools close as soon as reasonably practical. That included small island schools. By Friday morning, just 5 days later, Robin Chernow, a community development officer in the education team and the student coordinator of the TLC, was placing an order with the National Digital Equity Center to ensure that all of our island students had access to devices and reliable internet. I'm going to go through a brief timeline of events during the first couple of weeks of this crisis so that you can understand how quickly that response happened and how quickly all the TLC teachers came together to create a schedule and a plan. And I'm sorry, I have to rely on my notes for this. Okay. So the week of March 9th to the 13th, the Monhegan School and Isla Ho School were on an annual ski field trip together at Sugarloaf. This is one of the 4 times annually that these schools get together in person. We brought hand sanitizer and alcohol wipes because the coronavirus was present in the United States, but according to the national government and mainstream media, it was no big deal, like the flu. Wash your hands, stay home if you feel sick, yada, yada. It was a great trip and everything seemed very normal. At the end of that trip, Thursday evening, the 12th, at our hotel, we became aware of the rapid increase of coronavirus cases in the United States and abroad. The media went from painting the coronavirus as being a distant foreign concern to being a huge domestic concern, seemingly overnight. I spent the weekend in Portland. Though the coronavirus was definitely on everyone's minds, the procedures were beginning to change. Things were pretty normal. Restaurants were open. People were on alert, but still functioning mostly as they had been. I was expecting to go to school as usual on Monday. When the civil state of emergency was announced on Sunday night, we found out that most schools would be closed to students on Monday and Tuesday. I was directed by my superintendent to use those days to plan for remote learning that was likely to go into effect for the next couple of weeks. By Wednesday, March 18th, I learned that schools would likely be closed until April 27th, and that remote learning plans should be put in place for that time period. Each day brought new, ever-changing procedures and plans. The school committee and the superintendent immediately started to set up protocols. For the safety of the students and staff, only the ed tech and I were allowed into the school. I'm sorry, I lost my notes. Were allowed into the school. And on that, by that Tuesday, it was only allowed for me to go into the school. I'm falling apart, Yvonne. I'm sorry. I'm ill prepared. I'll just keep riffing. I'll see what I can do. This goes into my learning about being flexible and rolling with it. This is one of the lessons that I've learned as being a TLC teacher. So by Tuesday, it was just me allowed in the school. I spent the next couple of days scouring my emails, going through all of the virtual learning tools that I had, creating spreadsheets for my students. That Wednesday, all of my students had one-to-one devices, and I ensured that they were able to have access to internet at home. That evening, at 3:30, we had our first COVID-19 virtual teacher meeting, but that was already planned. So we went at it just like we normally do, and put out our needs and made a plan. That night, we decided that on Monday morning, we would go immediately into book groups. So this is a picture of our teacher meeting. But these are a team of that jumped right into action, and everyone was ready to go. Thursday morning, we had our first virtual morning meeting. And this was able to happen because the kids were comfortable with the technology, and because we had access. They each had a device to be able to use. After our first meeting, where the kids were so excited to see each other, and they were sharing artwork, and they were sharing toys, and they were just exuberant. It had been a week since they had seen each other. I realized that I needed to reestablish some meeting expectations and norms. And this is something that is rooted in the work that the TLC has done in SRI, School Reform Initiative. And so one thing that is really important, and that I've seen over and over again since since the crisis has happened, I've become so aware of how skilled my students are, not only at the use of technology, but at meeting these expectations. So they have been able to step up and share, but also step back and really allow room for everyone else to share their ideas as well. And that is a core of SRI beliefs, and that's the core of the TLC, creating equity and excellence in education. And that means that we do not have access to things that mainland have. But that has forced island teachers to be innovative and resourceful. We certainly use island resources in the community. All island schools have incredibly talented community resources to pull from. And we also have amazing and abundance of natural beauty so that we can do place-based learning. The isolation, though, has forced us into being, and part of that is reaching beyond the borders of our tiny islands and using technology to connect. Island students and teachers have been collaborating virtually for 10 years. The TLC couldn't exist the way it does without technology. Though we cherish our 3 to 4 annual in-person field trips, where not only the students, but the teachers and parents get to reconnect with friends and peers, those relationships wouldn't remain so strong if it weren't for year-round virtual connections. The foresight of then Governor Angus King and the creation of the Maine Learning Through Technology, MLTI, which began in 2002, to equip all middle school students in Maine with a laptop is remarkable. The program has now expanded to elementary and high school as well. It was one of the first initiatives like this anywhere in the world, and the first in the United States. Without that investment in access to technology for all, not just for students who could afford it, Maine wouldn't be in as solid a place as it is now, and the TLC could not have existed. I just received an email yesterday that MLTI is offering free virtual coaching for remote learning with Apple MLTI professional learning specialists for all Maine teachers, not just teachers from schools that participate in the program. Now that we are in this crisis, I hope people realize now how important these programs are. Now the major inequities of access lie in infrastructure of broadband to rural communities. This pandemic has brought those inequities into sharp focus. The Island Institute has been helping rural and coastal communities gain access to broadband. In January, the United States Department of Agriculture committed $10 million to 4 broadband infrastructure projects in Maine. Due to lots of hard work from the Island Institute and members of the broadband team on Monhegan, the Monhegan Plantation is one of the communities that will benefit. Though Monhegan is fortunate to have the access to internet that we do have, our bandwidth capabilities are significantly less than urban communities. The only reason it's able to work for virtual learning right now is because our off-season population is so small. When we're at full capacity in the summer months, some businesses and residents can barely check their emails. The hardest part of teaching and learning in a remote school is not having peers to collaborate with. To try to learn and develop ideas alone in a bubble is a real challenge. My best learning, just like my students, is when I can talk face to face, either virtually, but better yet in person with peers. When there are challenges with behavior, academics, or social emotional issues, I definitely feel like I'm adrift on an island alone. I can't talk to anyone in the community about those challenges to protect student confidentiality. It can feel overwhelming at times. I know other island teachers feel that way too. Those parents and teachers that are trying to figure out how to teach their children or students from home right now are probably feeling that same sense of isolation and overwhelm. The virtual teacher meetings and the critical friends meetings are lifesavers. If you teachers and you parents that have become home haven't yet created a regular schedule to plan, vent, and debrief with peers during this crisis, you should do it now. And for everyone else, if you're feeling isolated and alone, I know from personal experience that virtual connections do help maintain our relationships. I've experienced it myself, and I've seen it with my students, who, when they're finally back together in person, jump right back into those relationships after months of no in-person contact. As I'm sure everyone is feeling right now, not having an audience of peers is both difficult socially and academically. When students have same age peers to collaborate and share with, their work is always elevated. That's why virtual learning collaborations have been essential to island teaching. My students have engaged in whole group share-outs and dance parties with all of the TLC schools, as well as smaller weekly book groups that are broken up by age and ability. Last year, my 2 middle school chemistry virtually with the teacher on Cuttyhunk Island and her 1 middle schooler. While I taught states of matter and physical and chemical changes to my 3 younger students. Both technology and collaboration are essential to differentiation in island schools. Having access to the skills and assets of the other teachers enriches learning for all TLC students. As I've said many times, it's impossible for one teacher to be a master of every subject for every grade. So knowing when to get help from an expert or outside resource is key to meeting the needs of my students. Flexibility is a theme in island teaching. It's embedded in my teaching practice as well. It's one of the habits of mind that I refer to daily with my students. Be equal to being successful instead of completely stressed. Island enrollment is always fluctuating. In the 6 years I've been at the Monhegan School, I've never had the same students for an entire year. There have been as many as 11 students and as few as 3. I think it's important for my students to get as many social interactions as possible with different kids. So I've always been open to families who want to experience the island during the school year, even for a short time. 11 students may seem like a small class, but when suddenly I have 2 new middle schoolers when I had none the day before, I have to have flexibility of mind to quickly assess and come up with a suitable curriculum. The weather is such a huge factor in island living. Everyone who lives on Monhegan pays close attention to the tides and is constantly watching the marine past for and wind gusts. Several times we've had to leave day for a field trip and stay inshore for extra days on the other end due to foul weather. This calls for extreme flexibility from families as well. Islanders always have a plan B at the ready. So adapting to the current crisis was just another example of island teachers and parents using their skills as innovators and flexible thinkers to continue engaging and supporting their learning communities without being able to be together in person.
Unmute. So we're gonna shift over to some questions, and some of the questions are ones that I've collected ahead of time, and then others will address in the chat. So not the chat, the Q&A feature. So if you have specific questions that you'd like us to address, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. And I will say there was a question about the chat, and we decided not to use the chat feature today just because we're learning and we were worried we wouldn't be able to kind of keep track of it. So apologies for those who are used to using the chat and being able to sort of communicate with the group that's out there. And we'll work on getting to that later on. So for one of the questions, I want to jump back to some of what you were talking about earlier, Mandy, specifically around the facilitation that we do online. And so if you could just talk a little bit about how we facilitate meetings online, both for students and parents, but also now that so many school boards and community groups are finding themselves online many times for the first time. Can you just talk a little bit about how we help make that those meetings run more smoothly and be more equitable in terms of voice and how people are able to participate?
Sure. I'll go back to that slide about meeting expectations. Again, one of the foundations of SRI is to promote equity. And a way to create equity is to have everyone understand what the norms are from the beginning and set expectations. And that works in meetings with students. It works with meetings with teachers. It works if you have a town meeting. If everyone knows the rules in the beginning, then everyone can follow them. If they don't know the rules, then it's hard to be upset with people when they're not following them. And so the idea of stepping up and stepping back is one of those pieces of equity. And so knowing that they have to say is important, what everyone else has to say is also important. So really teaching students that they will have a time to share, but it's important to allow others to have time to share as well. And I've noticed that I've been in some adult-only Zoom meetings with people that are new to the platform since the crisis began. And they're all adults that just don't know how to communicate virtually. And so people are talking over each other, they're keeping their microphones on. I was in a meeting recently with, like, someone had some loud machine going and the presenter had to stop what she was saying and ask them to mute. And so, you know, everyone's learning. And so if everyone came to that meeting and the expectations were set clearly at the beginning, then it would have been a much more effective and succeeding. And so one of the things I've really become aware of is how skilled the TLC students are at understanding the importance of them stepping back and giving everyone else a chance to have a voice, even in this virtual setting, maybe especially.
Great, thank you. Another thing I want to ask you about comes from earlier in the presentation when you were talking about the shift, the sort of quick shift that had to go from being an in-person teacher to being online. I think that the slide of Mo Williams and just sharing a bit about some of the resources that you decided to use and how you were able to kind of pull those things together.
Yeah. Because I have students sometimes in preschool through 8th grade, technology is essential to ensuring that every student's needs are getting met, which means often I have to find age-appropriate technology tools for kids to be accessing while I work with another group of kids on specific skills. And so all of these kids have become really comfortable using technology. So they use SumDog and RazKids, and there are, the Dreambox and Google Classroom, Zoom, of course. There are a bunch of resources that they were already really familiar with. But then since the crisis happened, like anyone who's an educator here knows, my inbox was just flooded with free resources from different companies, as well as other teachers sending resources my way. And so not only did the kids get access to resources that they were familiar with, but I also gave them a whole new bunch of tools. But because they had technology literacy already and were comfortable with the devices and how to use them, and technology independence, those new resources they were able to get on board with really quickly.
Great, thank you. So let's go back to the question slide, and I'm going to ask you a question that often comes up when we talk about working on island schools and just living on islands in general, and that is just the question about the winter. Like, what is it like being on Monhegan all winter long? Mm-hmm. And we have a photo because that question usually comes up.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Monhegan is a very quiet place in the winter, and it continues to be right now. You know, normally in normal circumstances, this would be a pretty vibrant time with people coming back to open houses and get businesses ready, but it's still very quiet. So in the months of February or March, there are only about 40 people that live on Monhegan. It's like most of places in Maine as far as winter goes, except that there is a huge, like the wind is such a huge factor out here. I have a recording from the other night when that nor'easter came through of my house whistling very loudly because the wind just drives through the buildings. People lose, shingles off the roofs or the sides of their houses. It's pretty intense out here. So that's the big factor. And it's also considered one of the most remote islands, not because it's the farthest out to sea, but because our boat schedule is so limited. And so, and because we're out in open water, if the seas are rough, then often the boat gets canceled. So access inshore is very limited. Another reason that we have to be flexible.
Uh-oh, looks like you froze. Let's just wait a beat and see if Mandy comes back. And if she doesn't, we'll go to plan B. There she is. Are you back, Mandy?
I'm here.
Okay, you were frozen for a minute.
Yeah.
Not even a minute. Okay, great, thank you. So we've got a question here asking kind of about the way you structure the days, and so we anticipated that question as well. So we've got a slide with Mandy's schedule, but if you could kind of walk us through what a typical day was like last month, and then what a typical day is now. Like, what are you going to do tomorrow?
Well, the slide is actually not of my daily schedule. It's actually of the TLC schedule. So this is another way that the TLC teachers all came together, and Robin and Yvonne, to create a shared schedule so that we can collaborate virtually and to have as many opportunities as for the kids to connect. And so you can see here that there are different book groups happening, and then there's a story hour. And then the different tabs over on the left, the colored tabs, the Monhegan tab, I don't have up. I decided to do the TLC wide one. But so essentially what I tried to do immediately was to try to create the same kind of structure that we had in our normal school day. So school starts at 8 and it goes until 3 with a lunch break between 11:15 and 12:30. And so what pretty much all of the kids have done for themselves is they've created the same kind of school schedule. And so they have snack and break in the morning, they go outside and play at lunchtime, and then they have a quick 15-minute break in the afternoons. And then aside from that, they do work. We would always start our day with morning meeting. And so we're doing that now virtually. And so on that Thursday of the 19th, our first morning meeting was at 8 a.m. And all of the kids were already online talking to each other before I even got there. They were all ready to go. And then we had our first virtual share out that day at 12:30. I gave them a prompt in the morning. And so that's how we've been doing it. We've been meeting twice a day. 12:30 is when we would normally have reconvened after lunch. And so it just seemed to make sense for me to instill that same kind of structure. And I do have a teaching assistant who is fantastic. And so we've been able to create time slots to have in one-on-one virtual coaching, either with new technologies or specific skills for an hour each day. It's sometimes like 30 minutes to an hour, depending on what the skill is. And that's pretty spectacular. And in fact, it's giving me more time with my oldest student one-on-one, which is a benefit I wasn't expecting, but that's been a real pleasure.
Great, thank you. So there's a question here about technology independence and asking if you could talk a little bit more about what you mean by that. And then I want to piggyback that onto another question, which asks about how you use virtual learning with the younger children. So I don't know if you have really young children, but 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds. So more about technology independence with your students.
Yeah. So there's a photo of I'll go back to it. This is, I referred to MLTI before, and these are two, this is an MLTI educator and 2 Apple engineers that have come to the Monhegan School twice. and both worked through problems with our devices as well as teaching the kids and the teachers how to use many of these different platforms and apps. They've also taught all of the kids. And again, at the time I had the first time that came a preschooler who created a 3D virtual world and was able to do animations in Keynote. They showed us how to use accessibility features. And so iPads, if you've got younger kids, have accessibility features where, for instance, if a student is trying to write a story, instead of having a scribe type out the story for them, they can actually hit the microphone and speak into Keynote, and it will type out on the screen what they're saying. So that's the kind of independence that you can teach kids. And again, these MLTI education specialists are doing free coaching. And so maybe I can send that to you, Yvonne, so that it's part of this.
Okay.
But I advise anyone out there to sign up for some of those sessions because they're amazing, and you will learn so much.
Great, thank you. So here's another question that asks about kind of helping keep kids engaged online. It's hard to sit in webinars. We're all kind of experiencing some Zoom fatigue, or those of us who are on it for a long time. So how do you deal with that, with kids getting antsy, and about how much time are your students spending in front of screens each day now?
Yeah. So in order to try to create some balance, I have binders of work that are, on paper for kids to do, so they're not always online. The one thing, and so I'm able, and not everyone is going to have this luxury, or it's not going to fit into school's protocols or whatever, but I create a binder each week that has that week's work, and the kids have, I can actually pull one up. And the kids have their, they have a letter from me. They have their weekly schedule. And then they have a log, a time log of different, for math and for French and for ELA and for art, for each thing. So they have choice in what they do, and I give them access to all of those. Then their binders have worksheets and activities. There are science experiments and things like that in there for them to do as well. So I do try to balance so that it's not always online. The one thing that is hard, the online tools, many of the online tools give you like a daily view of what kids are doing, what skills they're working on. Whereas the binder, I don't see what they've done until the end of the week. So it's kind of a balance.
Great, thank you. Another question that I think kind of relates to the binder and just the schedule is advice for working parents about balancing taking care of kids, helping them with their school and learning, and then working full time at the same time, especially living on an island. So I'd love you to take a shot at that, and I can also give some ideas as well.
Yeah. So the very first week, one of the things I was thinking was, parents are working. I need to give the kids tons of work to keep them busy. And so I was like, 5 hours of math and 5 hours of writing and I was just like, all kind of like best practices that no teacher can ever meet, like every day you're supposed to, whatever methods class you take as a teacher, they want you to somehow have that be like a third of the day. And so when you add up all the hours, you can't possibly meet all of that. And so I kind of overwhelmed parents with that first week with both resources and, binder material, online resources and binder materials. And I was like, give me feedback. And they were like, too much. And so I totally heard it, and I've pared back and made it much more realistic. And really the thing that I think is important is not about how much work kids are doing, but that the work that they're doing has some sort of meaning and is keeping them engaged in their learning. So I'm trying to do that while thinking about keeping them on track. However, I think the real thing, the important thing is that they are learning like incredible life skills right now. Content isn't as important. They're learning about time management. They're learning about being self-directed learners. They're learning all of those same things about flexibility and adapting. All of those skills will serve them. And it's not about the content that they'll remember and carry with them, but the skills that they'll carry with them. So I would just say focus on nurturing the relationship first and making sure that they are cared for before anything, that they feel nurtured and cared for, and to not worry as much about the content and really think about like, what are the big picture goals and skills that you want them to take from this? Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that's great. And I'll just chime in with sort of reiterating what I said before, which is I think families are just incredibly stressed by this, whatever their situation is. And certainly some are more stressed with really fundamental needs, getting fundamental needs met. But the working family with trying to keep the kids in school, online is incredibly challenging. And from the DOE all the way to just every, teacher, parent that I've been talking to, the message we're trying to convey is that student needs and family needs come first, and that you're just not going to be able to kind of do things the way you used to. And certainly we want to keep kids learning, we want to keep them engaged, but as long as we're staying connected, like Mandy said, that is the top priority. And there's just going to be some stuff that doesn't get done right now because it can't, because it's just not possible. And so I think trying to just go for more harmony and less conflict in the house. And I know from talking with working parents that communicating with your teacher, and if it's too much work, really letting them know. Teachers don't know, like Mandy said, you don't know when you're just like shifting over to this. So real communication about like, do we have to do this? It's causing like a crying jag every night or every day. And just really being clear about the top priorities of just staying kind of grounded and connected, and focusing on like meeting emotional needs, physical and emotional needs, and then the actual learning of new content. If that isn't happening at the rate that it normally would, which it isn't for most, that's okay. And we'll kind of have to figure that out when we get out from under this. So I hope that gives some information. I want to shift to another question, which is asking to talk a little bit more about SRI, School Reform Initiative, and how that plays into sort of how we work in the TLC. So do you want to take that one, Mandy, and I can add to it if need be?
Yeah, I mean, so the TLCers that founded the TLC did it because they were all members of School Reform Initiative, and it was through the work that they were doing there. And again, it's really based on equity. They found each other and found this common need, that they were all feeling isolated, and that it started with teachers feeling isolated and needing a way to collaborate and connect, but also schoolers, and again, that social piece, and that, like I referred to before, in particular, middle schoolers need a push from peers, but they need social connection too, to do their best social and academic work. And so those teachers were really trying to figure out, here you have this classroom, like I was talking about, like you've got these older students that very often you're like, oh, can you work on your own? Because these younger kids need so much more direct instruction and support. And so in trying to figure out how to create an equitable learning environment for those older kids, they formed the Teaching and Learning Collaborative to first support teachers and secondly to support those middle school students. And then of course it helps everyone. It helps the kindergartners and the preschoolers, everyone in between. And so I think just really thinking about SRI makes you really question your biases and question what you're bringing to your teaching. And it really makes you think deeply about your practice. And so really thinking about each student and what each student needs, I think really helped the whole foundation of the TLC form, and why it's continued to thrive is because it forces all of us to try to bring our best selves and bring our assets to the table and collaborate and see, like, oh, you really want to teach science, or you're really strong with social studies. Will you teach my middle schoolers social studies? And I'll take the youngers and do this literacy work. And so to be able to really think about assets and needs, and using that lens of equity to try to meet each student where they're at, and use collaboration to do that.
Yeah. And I guess I would just say that the link to SRI will be in the list of resources, and that we could do a whole webinar on SRI. It's a really rich topic, but one of the key things is that they really promote the use of protocols. And so it's very structured. And so you really know why you're doing something, and you really think about the conversation that you want to have, and you choose a protocol to help you have that conversation. And at the beginning, the protocols can feel very restrictive and like you don't get to talk the way you want to, but they actually create a lot more purpose, and there's a lot more equity, again, to use that word again, in how everyone participates and the level that they are able to participate. And once you get the hang of them, people find that it really deepens their work and their connection with their colleagues. And there was a comment in the question box about just the fact that there's a lot of isolation in bigger schools too, even if it's not geographic isolation. And so I think programs and approaches like SRI can really help with that. And even if it's not school-wide, just finding one other teacher or a couple of teachers that you can sort of agree to work more deeply together and really look at each other's practices. And that's one of the other core pieces, is that for the TLC teachers, they all recognize that while their teaching practice is really important, so is the teaching practice of the teacher in the one-room school, that's 500 nautical miles away. And so that really all committed to not just their own teaching practice, but to really helping improve each other's teaching practice. And so that's a really kind of foundational part of it as well. So thanks for that question. I am going to now, we've still got 6 minutes. Okay, so a couple of questions just about how students interact with each other. So if you could, Mandy, just talk about, like, are kids using the chat? How do they connect with each other now that they're stuck at home? Are they spending time together outside of school? If you could just talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, pretty much immediately, two of my younger students who are in the same grade and good friends started doing every day at 3. They started FaceTiming and having Facetime Playdates where they will play with their little toys and show each other and do, fantasy make-believe stories. And I was told by parents that they're even like showing each other what they've learned on the recorder, playing recorder for each other, which I think is so sweet. Another thing, one of the older students has gotten really into 3D printing and 3D design. And so he's been he's created his own Zoom meetings where he is during the break times in the day from 10 to 10:20 in the morning, and then from 2 to 2:15 in the afternoon. And then sometimes after school and weekends, he is hosting Zoom Tinkercad tutorials. And so that's what he's been doing. And so he's taught all of the other kids via Zoom how to use Tinkercad. And he's helped them. He's done it. It hasn't been me at all. Like, he completely took over. And he, how to do it, I didn't know. And so it gives him leadership and connection. Yeah. So it's pretty awesome.
Great. So since we're entering the last couple of minutes of the webinar, Mandy, can you take us to the second to last slide?
Is this it?
There,
yeah.
There we go. And this, the sort of last question I want to ask you. Oh, nope.
What?
The beautiful one. There we go. The last question I want to ask you is just if you could kind of summarize sort of your key takeaways from your experience as a teacher in a one-room island school in Maine, but also sort of thinking about this incredible time we're in now with the COVID-19 crisis.
Sure. Yeah, I think being an island teacher has really helped me be flexible, like I said, and adapt, whether it's, having to stay inshore for 2 extra days because of a storm, or because, there's a pandemic suddenly that makes us have to close our schools. And the reality that online connections count. I've seen relationships grow and be sustained virtually. So this is a great picture because this is the TLC coming together, all of these kids from different islands coming together like no time has passed, and playing this game together. And that's what happens. Is so, for those of you that are afraid of the social impact of your kids and their lack of connection, those virtual connections really do help sustain those relationships so that and they are going to be able to, be in person again. So when that happens, they'll be able to jump back in. So those two things. And also just like striving for perfection is not attainable for your students or for yourselves. And so we have to be kind to each other and kind to ourselves. And it's okay to be imperfect. Like my printer, just before this, my printer went haywire, and the whole middle of my lecture, but you know what? You just go with it and you do the best that you can. And that's all anyone can expect of their kids. And that's all anyone can expect of themselves. So, and we know that out here with, nothing works perfectly, and you just roll with it, and you have to do with what you've got.
Great, thank you. So since we're pretty much at time, I just want to remind you that we will be sending out a list of resources, which includes a recording of the webinar. Also will include my email, because I definitely didn't get to all the questions, and I was trying to answer, and I think I lost a couple of answers there. So if you didn't get your answer that you were looking for, please feel free to email me and I'll make sure that you do. So we'll also have links to lots more information about the TLC. The TLC is very well documented, so we have lots of blogs and videos and articles, and so you'll get that information, as well as links to all of the different programs that Mandy mentioned that she's using. And so I just want to kind of end it with, that there's really no question that we're in these just incredibly challenging times, and we hope that this webinar has been of use to you, that it's maybe made you smile or given you a new resource or something new to think about during this time, especially when it comes to education. And so I just want to end by giving Mandy a virtual hug and a huge thank you for taking the time to share your insights and experiences with us as a one-room school teacher. And I also really want to thank all of you for spending this hour with us and being interested in the work of the TLC. And so with that, I will say be well and farewell. Thank you.